As of right now, the Ally X is probably the best handheld PC you can get, but it does share a lot of similarities with the original Ally. So in this video, I want to take a look at how both of them compare head to head and see if that higher price tag is worth it. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be the price. The new Ally X is coming in at $150 more than the original Ally. With that, we get the same Z1 Extreme processor, we have the same Radeon 780M graphics, and the same 7-inch 1080p 120Hz screen. The difference is, the Ally X comes with 24GB of LPDDR5X 7600 megatransfer RAM versus 16GB of LPDDR5 6400 megatransfer RAM. So it does come with more and faster RAM. It also comes with a standard 1TB 2280 SSD versus a 512GB 2230 SSD. The other difference is that the XG Mobile port was replaced with a USB 4 port, now making it more compatible with more external GPUs. It is going to be slower than if you were using the XG Mobile, but you do have a lot more options. Unfortunately, it doesn't play well with AMD GPUs, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The other huge difference, and probably the biggest difference, is going to be the battery life. It went from a 40 watt-hour battery all the way to an 80 watt-hour battery, and I will be touching more on the battery life here in a little bit, but let me just say that the battery life is slightly more than twice, even though the numbers would say that it's only doubling it. Up next, let's look at the hardware differences, starting off with the face buttons. These weren't necessarily bad in the original Ally, but they were a little bit rattly. These sit much better in the shell now and have less of a clank when you press down on them. The D-pad was also greatly improved. It's still a rubber membrane D-pad, which I prefer, but it feels much better to press down on, and it doesn't feel like you're pushing down the whole disc whenever you try to use it. It's also much easier to get more precise inputs when you're playing games like Celeste or fighting games. To me, the original one always had this weird mixture of stiffness and mushiness. It just never felt like I was pressing in the correct direction. Control-wise, I think the analog sticks are probably the area that saw the most improvement. They're slightly bigger than the original, but they also feel much tighter, so if you're into playing a lot of first-person shooters, these are going to be much better because it's going to be easier to get more precise inputs. That's not to say the original ones were terrible, it's just these new ones are a lot better. Taking a look at the top, we have a new design for the triggers, making them much bigger and more in line with what you would find on a full-size controller versus a handheld. We also have a new vent added to the middle, which is supposed to help keep down temperatures for the SD card and most of that middle screen area. And finally, over in the back, we can see a new design for the grips. They're not only bigger, but they're also rounded and much more comfortable to use than the sharper design of the original ones. The back buttons are also smaller and easier to press down, and we can see that the vents are also bigger. That, along with the new cooling, actually does a really good job of keeping temperatures down. Not only were the individual components improved, but the layout was also slightly modified. It might seem like a subtle change, but if you look at the left analog stick, you can see that it sits a little bit lower on the shell, while the D-pad sits a little bit higher up and closer to the screen. This, in my opinion, is a better use of space because it makes both of them more comfortable to use. Over on the right side, the face buttons also sit a little bit lower, and the analog stick sits a little bit closer and higher up on the device. This might not seem like a big change, but when you're actually holding it for longer play sessions, it makes a big difference. This also fixes one of my bigger complaints with the original Ally, and that's that your hands would sit too high up on the device and it would put your finger a little too close to that vent. And on longer play sessions with more demanding games, it would start to get a little uncomfortable. I was going to do a whole dedicated segment on the fan noise and the temperatures and put them all together, but honestly, temperature wise, you're going to see the difference later on when we do the gameplay testing. And as far as the fan noise, both devices are pretty quiet. I was actually getting more ambient noise than actual fan noise when I was trying to do that recording, so I just decided to skip that. However, I will say that the Ally X is better at keeping temperatures down and the fans are quieter. So if that does matter to you, you want the quietest possible device, I think the Ally X is going to take that as far as like handheld PC is concerned. One of, if not the biggest selling point for the Ally X is that huge 80 watt-hour battery. That on paper supposedly doubles the battery life, but in actual application, it goes a little bit further than that. Now, getting you exact numbers is a little bit tough because there's a lot of things you can do to extend that battery life, and there's different games that are going to be more demanding than others. So the best thing I can do is just give you ranges. So on the Ally X at 25 watts, you should expect an hour 45. The addition of USB 4 is really awesome. It was a pretty big selling point for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other people. Unfortunately, the compatibility isn't as good as it could have been because Asus went with the C1 Extreme chip, which is an awesome chip. It's great for handhelds and it's very powerful, but it uses custom drivers. So you can't just take any AMD GPU or GPU dock and just plug it in and have it work right off the bat. Now, if you're using an NVIDIA GPU or even Intel, you should be able to just download the drivers and you're good to go. So for this section, I'm going to put an asterisk on it. It is awesome that USB 4 was added and that it has eGPU support for things other than the XG Mobile like the original Ally did, but compatibility could have been better. However, there is a way to make them work, and I decided I'm going to make a dedicated video for that instead of trying to cram that in here, unless AMD does an update and we get somehow eGPU support for other AMD GPUs on the C1 Extreme. I don't think that's going to happen, so keep an eye out for that video. So, final thing I want to touch on before we get into game testing is going to be the software. And they're both running Armory Crate, so there's really not a whole lot to say here, other than it is more stable on the Ally X. On the original Ally, I would get crashes sometimes, so I would have to relaunch Armory Crate. But that's about it. Armory Crate in general is pretty awesome, and it makes Windows very usable on a handheld. Okay, so let's get into the most important and longest section of this video, and that's going to be performance. So first up, let's take a look at some benchmarks using TimeSpy and Firestrike. Now for these, I decided to go with the performance profiles and leave them as is, just to show how much of a difference that 3 and 2 watts make in that quiet and performance mode. And here in TimeSpy, you can see that in both quiet and performance, that extra power does make a pretty big difference. But when we get up to the 25 and 30 watt range, it's not as much. With Firestrike, we see more of the same. The lower power profiles see a big boost, and the 25 to 30 watts, it's a little bit more even, with the Ally X still coming out on top. So in synthetic benchmarks, we can see that the Ally X does come out on top, but the power profiles make it a little bit trickier to benchmark things. So I wanted to see what would happen if we actually set both of them to the same 10 and 15 watts, because in theory, you could just up the watts on the Ally and get very similar results. So I capped the Ally X at 10 and 15 watts and I ran a couple games. So first up, we have Nier Automata at 720p, and as you can see, there really isn't that big of a difference in the FPS. Maybe 1 or 2 here and there depending on what's going on screen. But if you take a look at the 1% lows and the temperature, you can see that there is a pretty big difference there. And at 1080p, it's pretty much the same thing. We see slightly better frame rates, maybe 1 or 2, but with much better 1% lows and better temperatures. So what I'm going to do for the next 2 games is just let them run for about a minute each so that you can see how they're going to be performing at 10 and 15 watts. And then we'll come back and look at the rest of the games running at the normal power profiles. So at 10 and 15 watts, the differences are very minimal, but there is still a difference. You can see with the 1% lows on the games where it was actually working, because for some reason I could not get a consistent reading on them. Sometimes I would get a 0, sometimes I would get 1, and sometimes I would get absolutely nothing. So I don't know what was going on with that, but it was a little bit frustrating. However, you can still see temperatures, you can still see VRAM using, memory usage, and the frames. So hopefully that is enough for you to get a good idea of it. Now, that was capping the Ally X at 10 and 15 watts. However, those aren't the actual power profiles that the Ally X is working with. And because of that, for the next few games, I'm going to be testing everything at 720p, 1080p, low settings, using the default power profiles.
Yeah, just tell me when to shoot.
¡Un forastero! ¡Agarradlo! ¡Seguidle!
Well, hard work and good luck go hand in hand.
I have to head. I need to go back. Got a case to solve.
With Cyberpunk, I made a mistake and I left the ray trace shadows on, so that will affect performance, but for this video, it's really not a problem because both were running it the exact same way, and the idea here is to see how they compare to each other, not how well the game can run. That being said, as you can probably tell from all these games, there isn't a huge performance boost from the Ally to the Ally X. It's mostly around 3 to 5 FPS, which if you're playing a game that's only really running at 30 FPS, can make a difference, but for the most part, you're really not going to notice that big of a boost as far as just the pure frames per seconds go. As far as smoothness, the LAX is going to feel a lot smoother. After playing all of these games over and over again in the same areas, I did notice that consistently the LAX had smoother gameplay and things just seemed to load a little bit better. I never really noticed any issues with like texture poppings or anything like that. And that's where I think the extra resources and the faster RAM is going to come into play. One weird thing I did notice with the Ally is that even when I gave it more VRAM up to 6GB, it would still stay within that 4GB range. Until I went all the way up to 8GB and I started to push the settings up a little bit more, did it actually pass that. So I'm really not sure what's going on there, because you would think that if there's more VRAM available and the game is asking for more, it would just take it, but it didn't. For some reason, it just kept using less resources than the Ally X, even with the same set. Now, this doesn't mean that having more VRAM isn't helpful, because there are going to be games where you do need to crank it up to 8GB to have better performance, like with Call of Duty and the Ally. And if you do that, you're only left with 8GB of system RAM, which could be an issue in certain games. Now, another area where it's very useful to have extra VRAM is if you're trying to play games at higher resolutions and you're also trying to use frame gen, which is also going to be using some of that VRAM. So definitely having that 8 gigs of VRAM is going to be very helpful. And with the Ally X, the big benefit is that because you have that extra RAM, you don't really have to worry about going in and configuring things. Okay, so now we come to the most important part of the video, and that is whether the Ally X is worth it or not. And I think it really comes down to who you are. If you're somebody that's just entering the handheld market and you want a high-end handheld PC that can pretty much play anything, the Ally X is going to be one of the most complete packages. And the price difference between the Ally and the Ally X is only $150. When you start to look at an extra power bank, the extra storage, and the new features of the Ally X, I think that $150 makes a lot of sense for somebody that's just now entering that market. However, if you already own an Ally and you're pretty happy with it, the battery life isn't an issue for you, you pretty much mostly play at home, then maybe holding off until the next Ally is going to be the best move for you if you do want to stick with this line of handhelds. Because the reality is that as far as performance, you're really not going to see anything next gen. It's not going to be anything crazy that would really push the needle for a lot of people. However, if you have an Ally and you're not happy about the battery life, there are certain things you wish were better, then the Ally X might make sense, especially if you can sell your Ally for a good price and make up part of that cost. This is not a next-gen device, but it is a really good example of what a company can do if they pay attention to what their users are wanting them to do with their devices. Pretty much every criticism the original Ally got was addressed with the Ally X. For me personally, the only thing that could have made this any better was maybe a bigger screen, but I get it, this is just a refresh, so that wasn't really in the cards, but it would have been pretty cool. Well, I think that's going to wrap this video up, and tell me what you think. Are you going to be upgrading? Did you already upgrade? Are you interested in picking one up? Or are you just curious about what the Ally X is doing? Please let me know down in the comments, and if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I appreciate everybody that took the time to watch this video, and I'll see you on the next one.